You have probably come across this picture in art history books, a photo of Robert Morris's seminal work at the Green Gallery in 1964. It's often hailed as one of the most important works in the early days of minimalism. The work is an assemblage of untitled polyhedrons, placed in various positions in the gallery. I saw a version of this work with a friend at Dia Beacon a while ago. He asked me the meaning of these works, and I hate it when people ask me this because it would take at least 10 minutes to explain, and it would be very boring to stand there and look at the work for 10 minutes because there isn't much to look at. It's an important work, no doubt, but is it a good work? To answer this, we have to talk about why it is important in the first place. In order to understand the context around the creation of the work, one has to understand the decade prior, in which a movement called abstract expressionism dominated. It's a movement that was very keen on big narratives, like transcendence, existence, death, and anguished men in the wake of World War II. And the abstract expressionists believe that non-figurative forms and colors have the power to embody those ideas. However, the next generation of artists, which Robert Morris belonged to, were very skeptical. They didn't believe in their message or their medium. And this work, the beams, are exactly the opposite of those paintings. What's abstract now becomes specific, and what's expressive now, rational and controlled. The artist wants the viewer to know what you see is what you see. There's no metaphor, no symbolism, no grand narrative behind the surface, like the abstract expressionists tend to evoke. In other words, there is no motivational core inside the work. So, if there's no motivational core, where does meaning come from? Morris says it comes from the context of the work, by which he means the physical and temporal relationship between the viewer and the object. This thinking is influenced by phenomenology, which is a field of study in philosophy popular in postwar France. It is the study of how things appear in one's experiences. Art historians, as well as many artists in that period, love to use ideas of phenomenology, or some versions of it, as their theoretical framework. For example, in this untitled work of 1965, Morris repeats the same L-shaped beams 3 times. He wants to show that one can conceptualize the L-shaped form in their head, but the experience of seeing them in the gallery space is determined by one's position to the beams, therefore oscillate, quote, between known constant and the experienced variable. The third important aspect about the work is how the artist wants to depersonalize it. Again, this is alluding to the abstract expressionists because they are seen as having big egos and strong personalities. Well, how does Morris depersonalize the work exactly? 1. He removes the so-called artist's hand from the work, so there's no unique style or mark making. 2. He likes to use mass-produced industrial materials, so the work is intentionally not expressive, and there's no sense of preciousness usually attached to work of art. Now we have covered the most common interpretations of the work. We can get back to the question of whether this is a good work of art. I want to first point out that it is a work that tries to reprove. The subject of its reproval, as I have detailed before, is mainly abstract expressionism, and to some extent the larger European tradition of painting. And that's fine, because any new movement, any act of building up, necessarily involves a process of tearing down. However, as we have moved away from that historical moment of the 60s, the work's primary intention of reproach, of tearing down, becomes less obvious to an audience that may not be familiar with or interested in that history. But the work stays in that historical moment and is unable to evolve out of that original context and take on new meaning. it is stuck in a self-involved conversation with art history. But that's fine too. Many historically important works suffer the same fate. They serve their purpose in the development of art and become a chapter in art history books. However, the issue here is that it sets a bad example in the context of contemporary art. It forces the viewer to engage with art history before one engages with the art. And one has to bear in mind that history is told through words. Therefore, the viewer has to unwrap layers of text first before one can properly or correctly approach the work. It's needless to say that this process is very cumbersome, which makes the work feel inaccessible to an audience that is some distance away from that moment in art history. What's worse is that because one can only access it through text, the textual element becomes inseparable from the work itself, and after a while, the text or the interpretation of the work replaces the work, and the art becomes a mere visual substitute for a lengthy philosophical statement that one can read in books. If you put aside the critical aspects, what's left is a particular aesthetic, a minimalist aesthetic, for the lack of a better word, and I'm a general fan of that aesthetic. What bothers me is the constant need to supply it with meaning. In its worst moment, the work feels like a lecture that can be summed up in terms of various concepts, and those concepts are often irrelevant to my experience and my outlook on life. The work, though important in its time, now struggles to resonate beyond its historical annotations. Yet, we see ample evidence of its effect in today's art. Meaning is so often freely attached to a rather random combination of objects, and one wouldn't know what to think before giving the discursive press release a good read. What it does really is to provide a set of vocabularies to draw on and talking points to say. I believe strong works should be able to stand on their own, and I think Morris would agree too. Indeed, shortly after the debut of the beams, Morris changed his medium from plywood to industrial-grade felt, a softer, more pliable material, visually intricate but nonetheless impersonal. Felt is an ideal medium for Morris, and Morris finds in it a new motivational core for his work, which is to show the logic of materials. In this case, because felt drapes down naturally, it acts as a manifestation of gravity. The fact that the work is soft presents an alternative to the often hard-edged, macho, industrially mighty image of the other notable minimalists. Instead, it brings to mind soft sculptures made by artists like Eva Hesse and Klaus Oldenburg. They all are poetic acts of subversion, and despite being very soft, they all stand perfectly tall on their own.